Welcome to the final video in our quest to find the cheapest PC. In our previous videos we did in-depth dives into the building and reviewing of 3 platforms. First one up was our workstation conversion. The second one was our absolute cheapest brand new PC we could build, and the third one was my personal budget PC that I built back just prior to Christmas. This is going to be our final installment, and what we're going to do is we're going to look through one more time, refresh ourselves on what parts were used and the prices, and then we're going to dive right into the final comparison. We're not going to have any benchmark footage. You can review the in-depth videos that I'm going to have linked down in the video description if you'd like to see the individual performance of each rig. But today we're just going to jump right into the actual side-by-side numbers comparison. But first, let's dive into the actual PCs used. So we're going to go from cheapest to most expensive. The first computer up was our workstation conversion. For this, I had bought the Lenovo P310 to go ahead and convert into a gaming PC. That came with everything you needed, short of a hard drive in order to boot up, but we wanted to make some upgrades before we did the testing. So it came with the i7 6700, came with 16 gigs of DDR4. I added a 500 gig SATA SSD. I added the GTX 1654 gigabyte, and I added the Thermaltake Smart 500 watt to power all of it. And then most importantly, don't forget when you do your conversion, most of them have OEM proprietary motherboards. You're going to need some sort of adapter to plug your ATX power supply into that motherboard. So we went ahead and picked up a 24-pin to 10-pin adapter. I had most of these parts sitting on my shelf, but I went in there and put estimated prices if you're going and buying used parts to make this happen for the absolute lowest possible budget, and I was figuring you'd come out about $190. The second computer we built was our brand new build using nothing but new parts, but as cheap as possible. For that, we selected the Ryzen 5500 for $99. We used that stock cooler on it. For the motherboard, we used the Asus Prime B450M. And then for memory, we picked up 32 gigs of DDR4, 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3200 megahertz. For the storage, in the interest of keeping the price low, we went with a 512 gigabyte PCIe Gen 3 M.2 drive. And then for the video card, we went out on a limb and tested out that PELADN Radeon RX 580 8 gig card. I was hoping that 8 gigs would really make a dent in performance and help us out, but we'll see when we get into the results how well that went for us. For the case, we just picked up the Sama case. It was the cheapest thing we had available. And then once again, just that absolute budget option, we went for the Thermaltake Smart 500 watt. And then kind of as my personal baseline, back in December, I had built a budget PC for myself. So I did things a little bit differently, but it also came out a little bit more expensive, and we'll see how that works out in the value in the end. So I went with the Intel 12600KF. I added a Thermaltake tower cooler to it just to keep it all running nice and chilly. I did go with 32 gigabytes in this build of DDR4 3600, so double the RAM of the other 2 builds and a little bit faster. For storage, I ended up going with 2 terabytes. I hate running out of storage, so in my personal build, I opted to go for 2 terabytes on the M.2 drive. And then for the video card, we went for that Hellhound 6650 XT, which kind of set my theme for the build. And then we did the Montec mesh case with a Corsair power supply. So we went a little bit higher quality on the power supply and a little bit more expensive on the video card here. Some of these prices might not add up to exactly what I had in my videos. This was kind of my planning guide for when I was purchasing everything, but some of the final dollar amounts came out to be a little bit different. So I think I ended up paying about $239 for the Hellhound. I will say if you're trying to emulate one of these builds today, the 6000 series products are selling out, and you used to be able to get them 6600 XT for about $200. Most of those are gone now. The 6600 regular is about $200, so they're getting harder and harder to find. I kind of wanted to go for a certain aesthetic, so I paid a little bit extra for the Hellhound card. If you were trying to go absolute budget, you obviously wouldn't do that, but I was using my personal build as the baseline to compare the other two, so we could see where the best value lies. So that's what parts we selected. And next up, we're going to go straight into head-to-head comparison on where the performance was. Okay, so I have compiled all three computers across our test suite of video games, and I've got them all on screen here. I don't want to go through and just absolutely read out everything. It's on screen, you can review it, but I do want to point out some, key differences in the different computers. So obviously the most expensive build, my personal Hellhound with the 6650 XT build, that one is double to triple the performance of the other two computers. Of course, it was significantly more expensive. What I want to focus more of my time on is kind of the losers bracket. So my brand new build with the RX 580 and then that workstation conversion, the old Lenovo. I honestly was shocked at how much these two computers traded blows, and they each had their own key loss and key win. So I knew it was going to be a risk going with the RX 580. It's an older architecture card. I think it originally came out in 2016, and I think the version I got was actually kind of a cut down model, which I think is partially what led to this, because the 1650 is a newer card, but even when it came out, it was documented to be slower than the RX 580, but that was the full version. So I have that 2048 SP. It's like the cut down version that was released later. So once again, you can go down in the video descriptions and look up the detailed information on each computer. But I think ultimately that's what played into this, because the Lenovo had a 4 gigabyte video card, and the RX 580 is obviously an 8 gigabyte, but it's a little bit older of a card and turned out to be a little bit slower. So the VRAM did not save it as much as I thought it would. So as we go down through the games, we're going to talk about some of the key wins and losses. So Modern Warfare 3, that's a title that just favors AMD. And I didn't know with going back in older generation cards if this would be a long-term trend. It was. So if you look at it, the RX 580, this was a big win for it. Its 1% lows are almost as high as the Lenovo's average FPS, and it's almost scratching that 60 FPS mark, coming in at about 54 on average. So with a little bit of tweaking of the settings, and we saw you could easily get it over the 60 FPS, and it's clearly beating the Lenovo workstation. Then you come down to Counter-Strike 2, and immediately the tables turn. The brand new build is getting absolutely embarrassed here by that Lenovo workstation, which Counter-Strike 2, extremely easy game to run, and I thought the newer generation processor and the new build would really help it out, but clearly we're still graphics card limited here, because the Lenovo GT pulls out a big win with almost, it's like 23 higher FPS, so it's not even close. It's coming out with a huge win. Then we come down to Fortnite. So as soon as, the Lenovo takes a win, he's going for a nosedive here. So in Fortnite, it's a large battle royale game. There's a lot for the CPU to process, and this is where the i7-6700 really showed its age. So the average frame per second, 96, looks good. It's beating out that new build RX 580. However, that 1% low, 6. I played a full round, and it was just extremely choppy on the Lenovo build. So every time you came to encounter another player, or every time you jumped in, it was game freezing, game stuttering. It never crashed, but if you go back and watch the video of the actual footage, the frame time graph is just all over the place. It was not a good experience at all, and the CPU is absolutely pegged. So unfortunately, that's going to be one of the things doing the workstation conversion. It was extremely cheap to build. However, you are working with dated equipment. So in this scenario, I would bet if we benchmarked a ton of battle royales, just because of the requirements they have on the CPU and how much stuff it's got to process that's not necessarily being rendered on screen, I bet we would see the similar result. So in this one, even though the RX 580 in the new build average was pretty close, 93 versus 96, but the 1% low absolutely destroyed the workstation Lenovo. So, and that, the new build, extremely playable. I would have no problem playing it all day. Fortnite on the workstation, I absolutely would not play it. If I loaded into one game and saw that, I'd be like, well, I'm done playing. I don't want to do this anymore. Next up, Forza. I thought the VRAM was going to be a large problem for the Lenovo because it only has 4 gigs. It was flashing when I was doing the benchmark. You know, hey, VRAM shortage. We're trying to pull up to 6 gigs. You've only got 4. And despite all of that, the Lenovo still took the win compared to the RX 580. You go down to Cyberpunk, they're almost neck and neck, within 1 on the average. Last of Us, once again, the RX 580 on the new build falls significantly behind, below the 30 frames per second, where the Lenovo workstation is averaging above 30. Resident Evil, they're both above 30. The Lenovo is higher once again and approaching 60, where the RX 580 is just lagging behind. And then finally, Alan Wake 2. Here came our huge loss for the RX 580. Upon loading up Alan Wake 2, there's an error saying you don't have the appropriate mesh shaders, and it might not run appropriately. And interestingly enough, I got a very similar error on the Lenovo, just saying I didn't have enough VRAM, but the Lenovo was actually able to play the game. The new build with the RX 580 was not. It would run 2 FPS, 1 FPS on the 1% low, and crash within minutes. So just not playable at all. So some of the data was surprising, some of it wasn't. I mean, obviously the 6650 XT absolutely decimated the other 2 builds, but it was between 2 and 4 times as expensive, so that's to be expected. And then in reality, I was just shocked at how neck and neck the used and the new build were each taking a loss of their own. So specifically Fortnite for the Lenovo, the CPU just was not powerful enough. And then Alan Wake 2 for the new build, the GPU architecture was just too old, could not support the game. So that's a lot of data and a lot of numbers to go over, but I think ultimately what we want to know is, so which one was the best value? So that brings us to our next graph here. So let me get myself out of the way a little bit. There we go. All right, cool. So from cheapest to most expensive, once again, we got the Lenovo with the i7 6700 GTX 1650 in there. I went ahead and across all the games tested, just averaged out the average FPS and the average 1% lows. And then I pulled out the average dollar per FPS. So on the average FPS and the 1% low, obviously the higher the better, but the average dollar per FPS, obviously the lower the better. So for the workstation build, it came out to $190 if you're building the whole thing from scratch, is my estimate. The overall game average is 60 FPS, and that seems really positive, but I would say, look at the previous data, it's very skewed. Some of those were running extremely high because they're esports games, and then when you walk into, your AAA, it's down near 30. So depending on your play style, it could be good or it could be bad. But average did come out to 60, just so we have somewhere to compare all 3 cards. Average 1% low came out to 36.4, and the average dollar per FPS puts this guy at the reigning champion of $3.1. So in this case, it was fast enough and cheap enough that no amount of power coming out of any of these other rigs was going to overcome that $190 price point. So next up, we come to our brand new build, the RX 5500 and the RX 580. It averaged 52.1 over the suite, a little bit lower than the Lenovo, but then the 1% low came in higher at the 41.3. But this guy comes out as the supreme loser actually in value, because the average dollar per FPS comes out at 7.7. So this guy is the most expensive by far. And then for the Hellhound 12600K and the 6650 XT, our average FPS came out to 153 with a 1% low at 107. So this computer is literally just about 3 times as fast, but also unfortunately 2 to 3 times as more expensive. So what came out in the value was $5.1 per FPS. So those are the 3 builds I actually built and tested. And so these are kind of my recommendations from where I would go from here. Is if you're unable to spend the money on a new build, I would probably look in the used market, with the caveat of I would ensure that I've checked the style of game that I want to play. So if you are a big Battle Royale guy, I'd probably invest a little bit more in the CPU, or different things like some of these real-time strategies, or like civilizations and city skylines, stuff like that's going to be really CPU intensive. I would make sure maybe go a little bit newer on the used CPU, and then go from there. So unfortunately, our 6700 just wasn't cutting it, and that's where it took the biggest hit. But for $190, if you don't play those types of games, I think it was a very solid combination. For the 5500 plus the RX 580, honestly, at this point in time, I just wouldn't recommend going with that RX 580. If you absolutely do not want to do used, and there is no way that you can spend a penny over $400, it will run most of the games you want to run, especially if you're not a big brand new AAA title type player. So if the dollar amount is set at $400, and it doesn't matter whether it's value or not, it's just you cannot spend more than that, and you don't feel comfortable buying used, then it is a build you can do. But as we saw, it was actually the worst value out of all the builds. And then we come to, my personal build, the Hellhound with the 6650 XT. And it came out, finally, I checked the receipts, it was $785. Its performance was so high that it actually put it in second place for value. But I realized that it's kind of in a league of its own due to the price. So I included this fourth build here, and you can see it's estimated, not tested. So from going back and reviewing my benchmark footage, the CPU was not a limiting factor in any of these tests. It was always the GPU. And between the Ryzen 5500 and the Intel 12600K, the GPU is still 100% almost of the time going to be the bottleneck here with that 6650. So I'm estimating that your results would probably be nearly identical. So I would say the better value would be if you combined the Ryzen new build that we did for $399, and if you hadn't bought that RX 580 and you bought the 6650 XT, it would put that price at $550, which would get that average dollar per FPS down to 3.6. So at that point, you would almost be on par with the workstation as far as dollar per FPS, but you would get that performance, the 2 to 3 times the performance out of it. So that to me would be the best value at this point in time. And I think you could easily build it for the sub 600. So why does my build not look like that? Well, I talked about it previously. I like to multitask, so I decided to add more RAM in. I hate running out of storage, because when you need it, and I'm going on, Amazon or Newegg to buy more, it's not going to be here for days. I hate that, so I went with more storage. And then for my own personal, comfort, I went with a more expensive power supply unit. That's up to you on how you want to do it, but even if you went with the more expensive one, you'd still be sub $600, but you'd be closer to $600. But ultimately, I think that's where the best value would be. So if it was up to me, I would probably spend the $550 to $600 on that 5500 Ryzen series CPU, the full build we did with that, but the 6650 XT instead. But if the 550 $550 to $600 is just absolutely out of the budget, so it doesn't matter what the value and performance is, then I would do something like the workstation conversion. There's a ton of games you could enjoy on it, and then I would just save my money for another day. That's honestly what I would do. But that kind of takes us to the conclusion here. That's the final numbers, where they all racked and stacked, all the numbers we got out of them, and then ultimately where the value is. I hope you enjoyed the series. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you give me a like and a subscribe, and hope you have a good rest of your evening.